But that was decades ago. Surely public opinion hasn't been so sluggish that it hasn't changed in that period of time, especially considering how much our society has changed in every other conceivable fashion. And what about the fact that soldiers in World War II enjoyed comic books? They weren't children. Also, for most of the 50s, superheroes were almost completely absent from comic books. The most popular genre at the time were romance and crime comics, both intended for adults. There has to be some other reason for comic books' bad reputation. Enter psychiatrist and juvenile delinquency expert Frederick Wortham. Wortham's anti-comic book polemic, Seduction of the Innocent, which was long on assertions but short on concrete evidence, created a stir by labeling comic books as the cause of virtually every form of juvenile deviance. He was a key expert called upon during the 1954 Kefauver hearings, which were court cases held in connection with the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency's investigation into the comic book industry. The hearings, along with Wortham's book, directly led to the establishment of the Comics Code Authority and contributed to the demise of EC. Prior to the investigation, however, a 7-question survey was sent to a large number of parties with vested interest in the issue, including public officials, publishers, and officers of national organizations. The survey found that 60% of the respondents felt that there was no direct link between comics and crime, and 70% thought that censoring or banning comics would have no effect on juvenile crime. But, of course, that little fact didn't make national headlines. What did make headlines was the courtroom exchange between Senator Estes Kefauver and William M. Gaines, in which Gaines maintained that crime and horror comics were harmless entertainment, and that the cover of a certain issue of crime suspense stories did not exceed the bounds of good taste. This being the 50s, McCarthyism was the rule of the day, and the public let irrational fears get the best of them. It wasn't long before Nazi-esque public burnings of comic books were held, and publishers were being accused of despoiling our nation's youth. The insinuation that comic books are a leading cause of juvenile delinquency is all the more preposterous when placed in context with today's society, in which there is more evidence supporting the exact opposite. Kids are senselessly murdering each other at a time when comic book reading among adolescents and teenagers is at one of its lowest points in history. Of course, other media are now being assigned the blame. The Kefauver hearings and the Comics Code Authority are the weightiest factors contributing to comic books' bad reputation in the U.S. In a time when, largely thanks to EC, comic books were making some great strides in artistic expression and maturity, nationwide paranoia caused the industry to withdraw into itself and set up a self-regulatory agency to ensure that comic books didn't tread too far into adult territory. No other entertainment industry in the world has such a strict set of guidelines governing it. Many feel that the Comics Code saved the comic book industry and that without it, comic books would have been driven to extinction by the courts. I'm not so certain of that. Even during the Kefauver hearings, it was made plain that outright censorship was not the issue, that freedom of the press was not to be restricted. By all means, the First Amendment should have kept the comic book industry safe from government interference. Sales would certainly have suffered, but with time, I think that would have been remedied. Other media have certainly weathered worse criticism than what was brought to bear against comic books in the 50s. The Comics Code only served to restrict what subjects could be dealt with in a comic book and reinforce the public's conception that comic books were suitable only for children. There is an interesting causality at work there. Since many of the books which passed the code were insipid and childish, the notion of comic books as a puerile form of entertainment was further justified. However, the books were so bland because the code required them to be. Yet, the public outcry against comic books is what inspired the creation of the code in the first place. How ironic that society is at fault for the shortcomings it claims to be inherent in comic books. What began as fear over the mature content of comics soon turned to disdain for the medium's perceived lack of maturity.